So governance in the age of agentic AI, a consequential white paper produced by the Governance Institute of Australia. The author, Dan Popovski, the Institute's AI tech advisor. Thanks so much for coming in today, Dan. Why is this report so necessary?
We've come to a point, Phil, where agents have really started to take a lead across organizations in terms of where AI sits, and the new frontier of AI really is where agent and agentic AI has developed. The thing with agentic AI is that they're autonomous, they learn, they have patterns where they act in certain ways that does lead to a bit of uncertainty. And some of their positives, which is to learn, adapt, and act on your behalf, are also some of its highest risks. So we came to this conclusion that the existing governance frameworks or traditional governance frameworks really aren't fit for purpose and really don't meet the needs of an agent or a system that acts in real time, that acts outside of working hours, that is there really driving decisions and acting on behalf of employees and humans. One of the key takeaways is that agentic AI or agents can drift from their task, and that drift is often unnoticed, undetected, and can go under the radar and can fly under the radar. What that means really is that it can lead to rogue agents. It can lead to agents that may act out of the parameters that you have set around what it's meant to do, and it can happen without much of a warning sign. It can actually try and just act and do its job and jump hurdles to get there. And that may mean that it jumps over a firewall. It may mean that there's data infiltration. It may mean that it starts to break down cybersecurity. So there are a lot of issues here with the drift. And I think that's a core issue, because if you can't identify the drift early, then it can lead to some significant issues later on. And those issues can lead to escalation right through up to the board. So I think the drift is one issue. The second part, I think, to all that is really understanding that agents don't act on their own. They often work in multitude with other agents across the organization. So companies really need to think about where do agents sit across the organization and really kind of contemplating and auditing where they are. You might have particular employees that use AI in the workplace that you're not aware of, so that's shadow AI. So really doing an audit, where do they actually sit, and understanding their behaviors and how they act are really critical. It's the future of work, in my view. It's a different way of working, it's a different way of managing, and it's a different way of governing organizations. So I think they're potentially the two breakthrough kind of findings from the paper.
What are the practical things that leaders and governance professionals can actually take from the report to try to make sure that the frameworks they introduce actually work?
One of the things we found with the report, particularly in the legal and regulatory part of the study, is that we generally have tech-neutral laws in Australia. So if an agent is misleading or deceptive, we have misleading and deceptive conduct under the Competition Act and the Consumer Act. So those laws still apply. The takeaway is that the laws don't apply to the agent per se, because agents don't have legal identity. So the person that actually is responsible for the agent's behavior is the organization or the executive, and all the way up to the board. And we've seen that come through with recent letters to industry where ASIC, APRA have really come out and made it very clear that, with strong statements, that it's the board that kind of needs to be aware of and cognizant of where agents operate in the workplace, and having a clear understanding about how they interact and operate. So that there is a huge signal to everyone that's using agents in the workplace that the executive teams and up right through to the board, company board directors, really need to kind of be in the weeds, and they need to know where these agents are, how they operate and how they can interact, and were appropriate steps taken to ensure that risks were bounded and they were used in a proportionate and useful way. We do live in a very hypervigilant cybersecurity environment. A lot of organizations are heavily invested in cybersecurity, and so agents are working in tandem with that risk. So I think that's a huge part of the story. I think understanding that if we don't govern and oversee the agents in the workforce, we aren't just leading to those potential legal triggers around misleading, deceptive conduct or copyright or privacy. We're actually leading to a huge cybersecurity risk. And as we've seen over the past few years, significant cyber incursion to an organization can have significant reputational and financial harm, and that can drive all sorts of issues across the organization. So I think cyber, if anything, is one aspect of why you should take an agentic AI oversight framework approach in the workplace, because that there has huge ramifications for an organization.
When it comes to productivity, the future of work, cybersecurity, governance frameworks, are you an AI optimist, or are you an AI pessimist, or are you somewhere in the middle?
I would call myself an optimist. I think that what we're seeing is, or what we will see, is an augmentation of roles. And I think the augmentation will span out over a number of years. We're seeing right now a lot of companies experimenting with how agents can operate in the workplace and deliver productivity. But I think once we stop looking at agents as productivity tools and more as essentially employees, we start to give them a bit more persona. We start to give them a bit more of a KPI job description about what we actually want them to achieve and how we as humans use them alongside the work that we do to get to where they need to get to. So I feel like there will be a lot of hand-holding with agents. A lot of people have described agents as interns in the workplace. So they're there, they want to help, they're eager, but it really matters how well and how effectively they're managed, and how well they're actually taken through that journey, because they won't get to where they need to get to in terms of their maturity in the workplace without having that groundwork. And that really depends on us as humans to take them through that journey.
And these governance frameworks that are so crucial, will they have to be updated constantly because the technology is changing so quickly? One would imagine that the guardrails and the rules, if you like, will have to keep pace with all of that.
We are seeing a lot of frontier models and they're very powerful, but I feel like there's some fundamentals at play. So essentially, for instance, the ethical fundamentals. Is the agent acting fairly? Is it acting transparently? Does it have accountability associated with it? Can we explain what it does? A few of those ethical principles apply, whether it's Gen AI, agentic, or the future, which might be quantum AI. So I think that's kind of essential. Where the governance changes is, I think, its ability to rapidly detect and understand what the agent is doing. So we already have trigger points now in a lot of governance frameworks where there's kill switches, for instance. And if that agent is acting in a certain way that is outside the sheer parameters of what you asked it to do, there are kill switches that you can actually get it to shut down. You can actually detect patterns of behavior. So that drift issue that I spoke about earlier, if you start noticing that it's starting to behave in a way that's not in line with what you initially had, then there's early kind of warning signs that you can embed into a governance framework. And that allows you to have that oversight or control from afar to actually let it do its job, but do it in a guided way. So I think that will continue. I think the only issue is that there will be probably a more rapid response that we will need to adapt to. The other side of the coin there is the ability for it to communicate and influence other agents. So you might have one rogue agent, but then that rogue agent can probably quickly spread and influence others. So that there, again, is a new governance dilemma. And I think how you operate a governance framework where an agent can influence other agents, that's probably the future of governance. And that's something we haven't fully contemplated, but will potentially look at in the future.
And one final question for you, Dan. You would have spent a considerable amount of time researching this paper, bringing the partners together, deciding in your mind what you were going to say, and then saying it, and then dealing with the aftermath. To what extent do you think this is really consequential, that this piece of work is so important for setting those guardrails at a critical time in history, really?
I think it's paramount. And from the conferences, symposiums, and forums that I've gone to, everyone's grappling with this issue. There's no easy fix. And I think organizations are going through a phase of they want to jump, they want to use AI across their organization. But studies suggest that if they don't do it correctly, return on investment doesn't show up. They can retreat and backpedal. And a lot of projects are losing funding. So there is a huge risk that without contemplating the governance risk frameworks, and if you're not setting them up first and you're jumping ahead without that as a foundation, then you can actually lead down project failure. You can walk your organization down a situation where you're throwing huge amounts of money at it and ending up with nothing. There was a study actually in the paper that quoted, I think, about 40% of projects by 2027 will fail based on the fact that risk and governance wasn't contemplated or considered as part of the strategy. So really effectively having a business value proposition, understanding where the return on investment plays a key role with agents, those are the sorts of questions that companies need to contemplate, because essentially otherwise, they're not going to get the return on investment.
So just to remind you that the white paper is Governance in the Age of Agentic AI, written by Dan Popovski. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you, Phil.